Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I've been working night shifts at gas stations for about 3 years now, mostly to pay my way through community college in rural Pennsylvania. The job isn't glamorous, but it's usually quiet, and I can study between customers. What happened last October changed everything about how I see those late-night hours. The station sits on Route 219, about 15 miles outside Somerset. It's one of those old-style places with 2 pumps, a small convenience store, and a repair bay that hasn't been used in years. During the day, we get truckers, locals, and the occasional tourist heading to the mountains. But after midnight, the world becomes something different entirely. It was a Tuesday night, around 2:30 a.m. when the fog started rolling in thick from the mountains. I could barely see past the first set of pumps, and the fluorescent lights created these eerie halos in the mist. The air smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like old pennies left in rain. I was restocking the cigarette display when I heard the bell chime. A man in his 40s entered, wearing a stained brown jacket that reeked of something sour and unwashed. His hair was greasy, unkempt, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild, like he hadn't slept in days. What struck me most was his nervous energy, constantly looking over his shoulder toward the windows, his hands trembling as he placed a crumpled 20 on the counter. "Pack of Marlboro Reds," he said, his voice hoarse and shaky. As I rang him up, he leaned closer. I caught a whiff of something metallic and rotten. "You work here alone?" he asked, his eyes darting around the store like he was memorizing the layout. The security cameras, the cash register, the door to the back office. "Most nights," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Something about this guy made my skin crawl, but I'd dealt with weird customers before. He didn't leave after getting his cigarettes. Instead, he walked to the coffee station, taking his time, stirring in sugar and cream like he was in no hurry. "Quiet out here," he said, still stirring. "Real quiet. Bet you don't see many people this time of night." The way he said it felt predatory, calculating. I pretended to organize lottery tickets while keeping an eye on him. He finally left around 3 a.m., but not before walking slowly around the entire store, examining everything. Through the window, I watched him sit in his old blue pickup truck, just staring at the building. The next night he came back. Same time, same nervous energy, same bloodshot eyes. This time he bought an energy drink and chips, but again, he lingered. He asked about my schedule, when I got off work, if I lived nearby. I gave vague answers, but he seemed to enjoy making me uncomfortable. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "I used to work nights too. Different kind of work, though. More hands-on." He smiled when he said this, revealing stained yellow teeth. After he left that second night, I called my manager, Pete. "Probably just some drifter," Pete said. "But if he makes you uncomfortable, call the cops. Better safe than sorry." The third night, he didn't come in, but around 4 a.m. I noticed his blue pickup parked at the edge of the lot, just outside our security lights. He was sitting in the cab, and I could see the orange glow of a cigarette every few minutes. I locked the front door and called the Somerset County Sheriff's Office. 20 minutes later, the truck was gone. When Deputy Martinez arrived, there was no sign of him. I gave a description and license plate number, but without the guy actually doing something illegal, there wasn't much they could do. The fourth night started normally. Around 1:45 a.m., Mrs. Henderson came in for milk, a retired school teacher who sometimes stopped by when she couldn't sleep. As she was paying, she paused and looked at me with concern. "You know, I've been seeing a truck parked on Maple Road the last few nights. Old blue pickup. Driver just sits there for hours, watching the road toward town. My blood went cold. Maple Road was my route home. What time have you seen it? Usually round 5 was in the morning, right about when you'd be heading home, I imagine. After Mrs. Henderson left, I couldn't concentrate. The idea that this man had figured out my route home, that he was watching and waiting, made me feel sick. Around 3:30 a.m. the bell chimed again. My heart stopped when I saw the man in the brown jacket walking through the door. This time he looked different, more focused, more determined. His eyes weren't as wild, but there was something calculating that terrified me even more. "Working hard?" he asked, approaching the counter. He didn't buy anything, just stood there staring. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "Maybe," he said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it on the counter, a hand-drawn map of local roads. My address was circled in red ink. "Nice little place you got," he said, tapping the paper. "Real private. Trees all around. Neighbors not too close. Must get lonely out there." I reached for the phone, but he was faster. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "I wouldn't do that. We're just having a conversation." "Let go of me," I managed to whisper. "I've been watching you, learning your routine. You get off at 6 a.m., drive down Maple Road, turn left on Creek Bottom Road. Takes you about 12 minutes to get home. Am I right?" I couldn't speak. The reality of how much he knew, how long he'd been planning this, hit me like a physical blow. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice getting quieter, more menacing. "You're going to give me all the money in that register. Then you're going to walk outside with me, real calm-like. We're going to take a little ride." The front door chimed, and Deputy Martinez walked in. The man released my wrist immediately and stepped back, trying to look casual. Martinez took one look at the situation, and his hand moved to his service weapon. "Everything all right in here?" "Just buying some cigarettes," the man said, but his voice was shaky now. Martinez approached the counter and saw the map with my address circled. His expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me." The man looked at me, then at Martinez, then smiled, this horrible, cold smile. "See you around." Martinez arrested him right there in the parking lot. His name was Dale Kruger, and he had warrants in 3 states for stalking, assault, and attempted kidnapping. During the investigation, they found detailed notes about my schedule, photographs of my house taken from the woods, and what the detective called a kit, rope, duct tape, a knife, and other things I try not to think about. I quit that job the next week. Even now, 6 months later, I check my rearview mirror constantly when I drive home from my new job at a busy diner in town. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Deputy Martinez hadn't shown up when he did. The worst part isn't what happened. It's knowing that Dale Kruger is still out there somewhere. He got 5 years for the stalking charges, but that's not enough time for someone who had detailed plans to hurt people. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear that bell chiming in my dreams, and I wonder if he's counting down the days until he gets out. I've been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, covering routes across the American Southwest. I thought I'd encountered every possible scenario the road could throw at me, until one night in November when my rig broke down outside a small town in West Virginia. I was hauling electronics from Atlanta to Pittsburgh, running behind schedule due to construction delays. Around 11:30 p.m., climbing through the mountains on Interstate 79, I felt the engine start to sputter. The temperature gauge crept into the red zone, and I knew I was in trouble. I managed to nurse the truck to the next exit, which led to Millfield, population 847 according to the faded welcome sign. The main drag was completely dark except for a single street light and the glow from what looked like an old-fashioned service station about half a mile down the road. As I limped toward the station, I could see it was one of those places time forgot. 2 old-style pumps, a small office building, and a single repair bay with the door rolled up. What struck me as odd was that all the lights were on, and I could see someone moving around inside the bay at nearly midnight. A man emerged from the repair bay, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was probably in his 60s, wearing blue coveralls with "Frank" embroidered on the chest. He had silver hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. "Evening," he called out. "Looks like you got some trouble there." "Engine's running hot," I replied, climbing down from the cab. "Probably the water pump or thermostat. Any chance you could take a look? I know it's late." Frank smiled and adjusted his glasses. "Son, I've been fixing trucks in this bay for 43 years. Time of day doesn't matter much to me anymore." As Frank examined the engine, something began to feel strange. The town was completely silent. No traffic, no lights in houses, no signs of life except for this one gas station. Even for a small rural town, the absolute quiet was unsettling. "There's your problem," Frank said, pointing to coolant under the truck. "Water pump's shot. Lucky for you, I keep parts for most major truck manufacturers. Should have you back on the road in a couple hours." "At midnight?" I asked. Frank chuckled. "I know you truckers got schedules to keep. Besides, I do my best work at night, fewer distractions." He disappeared into the repair bay and returned with tools and a water pump that looked brand new. As he worked, we talked about trucking, changes in the industry, and small towns disappearing from the American landscape. Frank was knowledgeable and friendly, but something about our conversation felt off, like he was speaking from memory rather than experience. "You know," he said while loosening bolts, "I've seen a lot of truckers come through here over the years. Most are good people, just trying to make an honest living. But every now and then, you get someone running from something, or towards something they shouldn't be." Around 1:30 a.m., I decided to grab coffee from a vending machine near the office, but when I walked over, I noticed something strange. The machine looked ancient, the kind with glass bottles instead of cans, advertising Coca-Cola for 15 cents. "That machine been here long?" I called to Frank. "Oh, that old thing. Been here since I opened the place. Still makes the best Coke you'll ever taste, though. Uses real sugar, not that corn syrup stuff." I put in quarters, but instead of modern coins, the machine dispensed change in old silver coins that looked like they were from the 1960s. The Coke bottle was ice cold with that thick glass feel of vintage bottles. When I tasted it, Frank was right. It was different from any Coke I'd had in years. As I walked around stretching my legs, I noticed the calendar in the office window. It was turned to November 1967, with dates marked in neat handwriting. At first, I thought it was nostalgic decoration, but it seemed too detailed, too lived in to be fake. Looking closer through the window, the interior was like a time capsule. Old cash register, rotary phone, paperwork that looked decades old. Even the chairs and filing cabinets had that authentic mid-century look. "Frank," I said, walking back, "how long did you say you've been running this place?" "Opened it in 1962. Been here ever since. This town used to be busier. Had a lumber mill, small factory. But things change. People move away. Businesses close down. Now it's mostly just me and a few old-timers who remember how things used to be." Frank worked in focused silence for the next hour. I must have dozed off in the passenger seat because the next thing I knew, he was gently shaking my shoulder. "All finished. She should run smooth as silk now." I looked at my watch, almost 4 a.m. When Frank fired up the engine, it sounded better than it had in months. The temperature gauge stayed normal, and there were no warning lights. "What do I owe you?" I asked, reaching for my wallet. Frank waved dismissively. Don't worry about it, son. Just glad I could help a fellow get back on the road safely. I can't let you do all that work for free. The parts alone must have cost something. Tell you what, Frank said, cleaning his glasses. You just remember to help someone else when they need it. That's payment enough for me. I thanked Frank and climbed back into the cab. As I pulled out, I looked in my side mirror and saw him standing in the repair bay, waving goodbye under the bright fluorescent lights. I made it to Pittsburgh without problems and delivered my load on schedule. But during the drive, I couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. Something about the whole experience felt dreamlike, too perfect to be real. A few weeks later, I had another load through the same area and decided to stop by to thank Frank again. But when I took the Millfield exit, I couldn't find the station anywhere. I drove up and down the main road 3 times, checking every building. Where I remembered the service station, there was nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds. I stopped at a small diner and asked the waitress about Frank's gas station. She looked puzzled. Gas station? There hasn't been a gas station in Millfield for years. The last one closed in the early 1980s. I described the place. The old-style pumps, the repair bay, Frank who'd fixed my truck. The waitress called over the diner's owner, an elderly man who'd lived in Millfield his whole life. You're talking about Frank Morrison's place, he said slowly. But that's impossible. Frank died in 1987 and we tore down his station about 5 years later. Nothing there now but weeds and old concrete. I insisted I'd been there just weeks ago, that Frank had repaired my truck. The owner looked at me like I might be suffering from some kind of breakdown. Son, I knew Frank Morrison for 30 years. Good man, best mechanic in 3 counties, but he's been dead for over 20 years. I left feeling confused and unsettled, but as I walked back to my truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the ground near where I'd parked was a small puddle of motor oil, and next to it, barely visible in the dirt, was a single footprint from a work boot, the same size and pattern I'd seen Frank wearing that night. My truck still runs perfectly. Whatever Frank did that night fixed problems I didn't even know existed. The engine runs smoother, the transmission shifts better, and I haven't had a single mechanical issue since. I've told this story to other truckers over the years. Some laugh it off as hallucination brought on by fatigue. Others nod knowingly and tell similar stories about mysterious helpers who appear when travelers need them most. But a few, the old-timers who've been driving these roads for decades, just smile and say, "You met Frank Morrison. Consider yourself lucky." I still have that Coca-Cola bottle from Frank's vending machine. It's sitting on my kitchen table, and the date stamped on the bottom reads November 1967. I've never found another bottle like it. Whether Frank Morrison was alive or dead that night, he reminded me that the trucking community is built on mutual support and willingness to help fellow drivers in distress. The highway can be a lonely, dangerous place. But knowing there might be people like Frank still out there, watching over travelers, makes those long nights a little less frightening. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. The thing about driving cross-country at night is that you start to recognize the rhythm of America's highways. After 5 years traveling between Chicago and Los Angeles for my consulting firm, I thought I'd seen every mile of Interstate 40. That confidence nearly got me killed on a foggy night in Oklahoma. I was driving east from Amarillo toward Oklahoma City, making good time despite weather conditions that had been deteriorating all evening. Light rain had turned into thick fog that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. I should have stopped, but I was eager to get home after a 2-week business trip. Around 2:45 a.m. just west of Elk City, I realized I was in serious trouble. The fog had become so dense I could barely see my own headlights reflecting off the white wall of moisture. Other cars had pulled over, their hazard lights blinking like beacons, but I was still pushing forward at 30 miles per hour. That's when my fuel light came on. I'd been so focused on navigating through the fog that I hadn't been paying attention to my gas gauge. The needle sat firmly on empty, showing an estimated range of just 12 miles. In normal conditions, that would be plenty to reach the next station, but in this fog, I wasn't even sure I was still on the highway. I slowed down and started watching for exit signs, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see them until I was almost past them. By the time I spotted the third exit, my car was running on fumes and making the subtle coughing sounds that meant the fuel pump was starting to suck air. The exit led to a small town called Serres. At 3 a.m. in thick fog, it felt like a ghost town. I couldn't see any lights or familiar landmarks that would tell me where the gas stations were. My car was definitely running on fumes now, the engine hesitating occasionally. I was starting to panic when I saw a faint glow through the fog ahead. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a gas station, its fluorescent lights creating a hazy beacon in the darkness. The place looked old-fashioned, with just 2 pumps and a small building that probably dated from the 1960s. But it was open. I pulled up to the first pump just as my engine coughed one final time and died. I'd made it with literally no fuel to spare. The station attendant came out immediately, which surprised me since most places had gone to self-service years ago. He was a man in his 60s with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing a uniform shirt with Bill embroidered on the pocket. "Cutting it pretty close there," Bill said with a smile. "Fog's been causing problems all night. You're the third driver who's limped in here running on empty." "I'm just grateful you're open," I replied. "We stay open all night. Never know when someone might need help, especially on nights like this." While Bill pumped gas, I looked around the station. Everything seemed frozen in time. Old-style pumps, hand-painted signs. Even the prices seemed lower than usual. But the fuel was flowing normally. "You been running this place long?" I asked. "Oh, about 35 years now. Bought it from the original owner back in 1988. Been a good living mostly. Quiet, but I like helping travelers who get into trouble on the highway." When the tank was full, I went inside to pay and grab coffee. The interior was as retro as the exterior, with a cash register that looked like it belonged in a museum and shelves stocked with snacks that seemed to be from decades past. "That fog should start lifting in another hour or so," Bill said as he rang up my purchase. "But you might want to take it easy until then." I thanked Bill and headed back into the fog. The drive through the remaining fog was nerve-wracking, but I made it safely to Oklahoma City as the sun was coming up. I stopped for breakfast at a truck stop, and while eating, I struck up a conversation with a trucker. "That fog was something else last night," he said. "I had to pull over for 3 hours near Elk City." "I managed to keep going," I told him. "Had to stop for gas in Serres, but there was a station open all night." The trucker looked puzzled. "Serres? I don't think there's a 24-hour station in Serres. Most of those little towns roll up the sidewalks by 10 p.m. There definitely was. Old-style place with full service. Guy named Bill was working. "Huh. I've been running this route for 15 years, and I thought I knew every open station between Amarillo and Oklahoma City." "What was the name of the place?" I realized I hadn't noticed a name on the station, which seemed odd. Most gas stations have their brand prominently displayed. "I'm not sure. It was just off the exit for Serres, on the right side of the road. Older building, 2 pumps, full service." The trucker shook his head. "I know exactly where you're talking about, and there hasn't been a gas station there for at least 10 years. Used to be a Phillips 66, but it closed down and was demolished." I was certain he was wrong. I could still remember every detail: the smell of gasoline, the sound of the old pump, the taste of the coffee. There was no way I could have imagined something so vivid. But as I continued east, I couldn't shake the trucker's words. When I stopped for lunch in Missouri, I decided to research on my phone. I searched for gas stations in Serres, Oklahoma, and found listings for several current businesses, but none matched where I'd stopped. I also found historical information about the town, including references to several gas stations that had operated along the old Route 66 corridor but had closed over the years. One article mentioned a Phillips 66 station that had been a local landmark for decades before closing in 2013 due to declining business. According to the article, the station had been operated by Bill Henderson, who had owned and run the business for over 30 years before health problems forced him to retire. The building had been demolished in 2014, and the lot had remained empty since then. Bill Henderson had died in 2015, 2 years after closing his station. When I got home to Chicago, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I'd been so tired and stressed by the fog that maybe I'd hallucinated the entire encounter, but that didn't explain how I'd managed to fill up my gas tank. My credit card statement showed a charge for fuel purchased in Sayre at 3:17 a.m. A few weeks later, I had another business trip that took me back through Oklahoma. This time I made a point of stopping in Sayre during daylight to see if I could find the station. I took the same exit and drove to where I remembered it being. There was nothing but an empty lot with cracked concrete and weeds growing through the pavement. A historical marker indicated that the site had once been home to Henderson's Phillips 66, which had served travelers from 1978 to 2013. But as I stood in that empty lot, I could swear I smelled gasoline and coffee, just for a moment, carried on the wind. And when I looked at the concrete pad where the building had stood, I could almost see the outline of where the pumps had been. I've driven through Sayre many times since then, and the lot remains empty. But sometimes, late at night when the weather is bad and visibility is poor, I think I see lights in that empty space. Just for a second, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of what looks like an old gas station with its lights on. I don't know if Bill Henderson's spirit is still helping stranded travelers, or if what I experienced was something else entirely. Maybe the stress and exhaustion caused me to have some kind of vivid hallucination. But I know that on one foggy night in Oklahoma, when I was running out of gas and options, help appeared exactly when I needed it most. Whether Bill Henderson was real or not that night, he reminded me that there are still people in the world who will go out of their way to help a stranger in trouble. The highways can be dangerous places, especially during bad weather, but knowing that there might be people like Bill still out there makes those lonely stretches a little less frightening. I keep my gas tank fuller now, and I'm more careful about checking weather conditions before starting a long drive. But I also have more faith in the kindness of strangers, even if those strangers might exist in ways I don't fully understand. The idea had seemed perfect, a solo camping trip in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I needed a break from the city, a chance to reconnect with nature and find some peace. I'd spent weeks planning, researching the most remote campsites accessible only by unpaved logging roads, miles from any town. I arrived late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the towering canopy of ancient firs and cedars. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and clean water from a nearby stream. My campsite was idyllic. A small clearing beside a babbling brook, surrounded by dense forest. The silence was profound, broken only by rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked dinner as twilight deepened. The stars emerged, piercingly bright through gaps in the branches. I felt a sense of profound solitude, but not loneliness. It was comforting isolation. As night wore on, the air grew colder. I snuffed out my fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped up my tent. The sounds of the forest intensified in darkness. The hoot of an owl, rustling of unseen creatures, the gentle murmur of the stream. I felt completely at peace, drifting off to sleep. But then I woke up. Not with a start, but slowly, as if something had nudged me awake. I lay still, listening. The forest sounds were different now. The stream seemed to gurgle with more insistent rhythm, and the wind had picked up, sighing through the pines. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones from deeper in the woods beyond my clearing. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks with the branches, but the whispers continued, a low, murmuring chorus just beyond understanding. It sounded like conversation, but I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of human speech. My heart began to beat faster. I was miles from anyone. I hadn't seen another car for hours. Who could possibly be out here whispering in the forest at night? The whispers grew slightly louder, closer. They seemed to circle my tent, a soft, unsettling murmur that made the hair on my arm stand on end. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter, straining my ears. I could almost hear individual inflections, subtle shifts in tone, but still no discernible words. Then a new sound joined the whispers, a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone walking slowly on the soft forest floor just outside my tent. The footsteps were heavy, accompanied by rustling leaves and twigs. They seemed to be circling my tent, matching the movement of the whispers. My breath hitched. I froze, every nerve screaming. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't whisper. Animals don't walk with such measured tread. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling, but remembered there was no service. My flashlight was in my pack at the foot of my sleeping bag. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, right beside my head. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of hushed voices, so close they felt like they were pressing against the thin nylon fabric. I could almost feel the vibrations against my cheek. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to disappear. My mind raced, trying to conjure logical explanations, but there were none. This was something deeply, profoundly wrong. Then a single, clear voice cut through the chorus of whispers. It was a woman's voice, soft and breathy, but distinct. "He's here." My eyes flew open. The words had been clear, undeniable, and they had been spoken right outside my tent, as if the speaker was kneeling inches from my head. A wave of pure terror washed over me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. I wanted to bolt, but where would I go? I was surrounded by dense, dark forest, miles from help. The whispering chorus resumed, but now it felt different. It felt triumphant, like they had found what they were looking for. The footsteps started again, but instead of circling, they seemed to be moving away, slowly, deliberately, back into the depths of the forest. The whispers faded with them, becoming fainter until they were just a ghost of sound on the wind. I lay there for what felt like hours, rigid with fear, listening to the silence that followed. The forest sounds returned to normal, the stream gurgling, the owl hooting. But the peace was gone, replaced by chilling dread. I didn't sleep another wink that night. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the dimly lit ceiling of my tent, every shadow seeming to shift and writhe. I kept replaying the woman's voice. "He's here." Who was he? Was it me? And who were they? As soon as the first hint of dawn painted the sky, I scrambled out of my tent. My hands shook so violently I could barely pack my gear. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just threw everything into my car, desperate to leave. As I was about to pull out, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing where the whispers had seemed to come from. It was a small, crudely fashioned cairn of stones, barely visible in the undergrowth. On top sat a single dried wildflower, its petals shriveled and brown. It wasn't there when I'd arrived. I was certain. A cold dread seeped into my bones. It felt like a marker, a symbol, a sign that I had intruded. I didn't examine it further. I just got in my car, started the engine, and sped away, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I sat in a diner sipping lukewarm coffee, my hands still trembling. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation, but the memory felt too real, too visceral. I never went camping alone in deep wilderness again. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now holds a sinister undertone. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when I'm walking alone at night, I can almost hear it again. That faint, murmuring chorus, the sound of unseen voices whispering secrets in the dark. The Olympic National Forest is a place of incredible beauty, but it's also ancient and wild in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. There are places in those deep woods where something old still dwells, something that doesn't appreciate visitors. I was found by whatever watches from the whispering pines, and I count myself lucky that I was allowed to leave. The idea had seemed perfect, a solo camping trip in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I needed a break from the city, a chance to reconnect with nature and find some peace. I'd spent weeks planning, researching the most remote campsites accessible only by unpaved logging roads, miles from any town. I arrived late afternoon, the sun already dipping below the towering canopy of ancient firs and cedars. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and clean water from a nearby stream. My campsite was idyllic, a small clearing beside a babbling brook, surrounded by dense forest. The silence was profound, broken only by rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked dinner as twilight deepened. The stars emerged, piercingly bright through gaps in the branches. I felt a sense of profound solitude, but not loneliness. It was comforting isolation. As night wore on, the air grew colder. I snuffed out my fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped up my tent. The sounds of the forest intensified in darkness. The hoot of an owl, rustling of unseen creatures, the gentle murmur of the stream. I felt completely at peace, drifting off to sleep. But then I woke up. Not with a start, but slowly, as if something had nudged me awake. I lay still, listening. The forest sounds were different now. The stream seemed to gurgle with more insistent rhythm, and the wind had picked up, sighing through the pines. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. It sounded like voices. Multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones from deeper in the woods beyond my clearing. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks with the branches, but the whispers continued, a low, murmuring chorus just beyond understanding. It sounded like conversation, but I couldn't make out words, just the cadence of human speech. My heart began to beat faster. I was miles from anyone. I hadn't seen another car for hours. Who could possibly be out here whispering in the forest at night? The whispers grew slightly louder, closer. They seemed to circle my tent, a soft, unsettling murmur that made the hair on my arm stand on end. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter, straining my ears. I could almost hear individual inflections, subtle shifts in tone, but still no discernible words. Then a new sound joined the whispers, a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It sounded like someone walking slowly on the soft forest floor just outside my tent. The footsteps were heavy, accompanied by rustling leaves and twigs. They seemed to be circling my tent, matching the movement of the whispers. My breath hitched. I froze, every nerve screaming. This wasn't an animal. Animals don't whisper. Animals don't walk with such measured tread. I reached for my phone, fingers trembling, but remembered there was no service. My flashlight was in my pack at the foot of my sleeping bag. I didn't dare move. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, right beside my head. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of hushed voices, so close they felt like they were pressing against the thin nylon fabric. I could almost feel the vibrations against my cheek. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to disappear. My mind raced, trying to conjure logical explanations. But there were none. This was something deeply, profoundly wrong. Then a single, clear voice cut through the chorus of whispers. It was a woman's voice, soft and breathy, but distinct. "He's here." My eyes flew open. The words had been clear, undeniable, and they had been spoken right outside my tent, as if the speaker was kneeling inches from my head. A wave of pure terror washed over me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. I wanted to bolt, but where would I go? I was surrounded by dense, dark forest, miles from help. The whispering chorus resumed, but now it felt different. It felt triumphant, like they had found what they were looking for. The footsteps started again, but instead of circling, they seemed to be moving away, slowly, deliberately, back into the depths of the forest. The whispers faded with them, becoming fainter until they were just a ghost of sound on the wind. I lay there for what felt like hours, rigid with fear, listening to the silence that followed. The forest sounds returned to normal, the stream gurgling, the owl hooting. But the peace was gone, replaced by chilling dread. I didn't sleep another wink that night. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the dimly lit ceiling of my tent, every shadow seeming to shift and writhe. I kept replaying the woman's voice. "He's here." Who was he? Was it me? And who were they? As soon as the first hint of dawn painted the sky, I scrambled out of my tent. My hands shook so violently I could barely pack my gear. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just threw everything into my car, desperate to leave. As I was about to pull out, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing where the whispers had seemed to come from. It was a small, crudely fashioned cairn of stones, barely visible in the undergrowth. On top sat a single dried wildflower, its petals shriveled and brown. It wasn't there when I'd arrived. I was certain. A cold dread seeped into my bones. It felt like a marker, a symbol, a sign that I had intruded. I didn't examine it further. I just got in my car, started the engine, and sped away, tires spitting gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I sat in a diner sipping lukewarm coffee, my hands still trembling. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation, but the memory felt too real, too visceral. I never went camping alone in deep wilderness again. The silence of the forest, once comforting, now holds a sinister undertone. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when I'm walking alone at night, I can almost hear it again. That faint, murmuring chorus, the sound of unseen voices whispering secrets in the dark. The Olympic National Forest is a place of incredible beauty, but it's also ancient and wild in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. There are places in those deep woods where something old still dwells, something that doesn't appreciate visitors. I was found by whatever watches from the whispering pines, and I count myself lucky that I was allowed to leave. I've been driving delivery routes across the Southwest for 6 years, covering the vast emptiness between Phoenix and Albuquerque. The job requires a lot of night driving, especially during summer when daytime temperatures make the desert roads unbearable. I thought I knew every mile of that route until one night when my fuel gauge started acting strange. I was hauling medical supplies from Phoenix to a clinic in Santa Fe, running slightly behind schedule. It was mid-September, and the weather was still brutal during the day, so I'd waited until evening to start the drive. Around 10:30 p.m., just as full darkness settled over the desert, I noticed something odd about my fuel gauge. When I'd left Phoenix, the tank was nearly full. I'd topped off at a station near my depot. But now, less than 2 hours later, The gauge was showing just over half a tank. At first I figured it was just a glitch. Electronic components can be finicky, and my Ford Explorer was 3 years old. But 20 minutes later, the gauge had dropped to a quarter tank. Then, 10 minutes after that, it was hovering just above empty. This wasn't a faulty gauge. Something was seriously wrong. Either I had a massive fuel leak, or the gauge was malfunctioning in a way that could leave me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over at the next exit, which led to a tiny place called Paloma's Springs. The exit ramp was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the only visible building was a small gas station that looked like it had been closed for years. But as I got closer, I saw lights on inside and an old neon sign flickered weakly. Desert Row Station. Gas, food, repairs. I pulled up to the single pump, which was one of those ancient models with mechanical numbers that rolled over as you pumped. The whole place had a 1970s feel, from the hand-painted price signs to the faded Coca-Cola advertisements on the windows. But the pump appeared to be working. As I got out, I noticed my fuel gauge was now showing completely empty, even though the engine was still running smoothly. I popped the hood to check for leaks, but everything looked normal. No smell of gasoline, no visible puddles, no signs of damage. The station's front door opened, and an elderly man emerged, wiping his hands on a greasy towel. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and deeply tanned skin that spoke of decades in the desert sun. He wore faded jeans and a work shirt with Earl embroidered on the pocket. "Evening," he said, approaching my car. "Having some trouble?" "Fuel gauge is acting crazy," I explained, showing him the dashboard. "It was full when I left Phoenix, but now it's showing empty." Earl nodded thoughtfully and walked around the car, checking the ground for leaks. "Don't see any fuel on the ground. Could be a problem with the sending unit in the tank, or maybe the gauge itself." "How much gas do you think I actually have?" I asked. "Tell you what, let's fill her up and see what happens. If the tank takes a normal amount of fuel, then it's just the gauge. If it takes way more than it should, then you've got a leak somewhere." That made sense, so I handed him my credit card and watched as he started the pump. The mechanical numbers began rolling over slowly, clicking with each gallon. Earl seemed to be in no hurry, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. "Don't get many travelers through here anymore," he said as the fuel flowed. "Most folks take the interstate now. Avoid the back roads." "How long have you been running this place?" I asked. "Oh, about 40 years now. Bought it from the original owner back in 1983. Been a good living mostly. Quiet, but that suits me fine." The pump clicked off at exactly 22 gallons, which was impossible. My Explorer had an 18-gallon tank, and it had been nearly full when I left Phoenix. There was no way it should have taken that much fuel. "That's strange," I said, looking at the pump reading. Earl frowned and checked the nozzle to make sure it had shut off properly. Must be a problem with the pump. Sometimes these old machines can get confused. "Let me just charge you for what your tank actually holds." He adjusted the total to 18 gallons and ran my credit card. As we completed the transaction, I noticed my fuel gauge was now reading full again, which was a relief. Whatever had been wrong seemed to have corrected itself. "You might want to have that gauge checked when you get home," Earl advised. "Could be a wiring problem, or maybe the float in the tank is sticking." I thanked him and was about to get back in my car when he said something that stopped me cold. "By the way, you might want to take Highway 187 instead of staying on 25. There's construction about 50 miles south of here. They're repaving a bridge and traffic's been backed up for hours." I pulled out my phone to check traffic conditions, but I had no service. "Are you sure about the construction?" "Oh, it just started today. They don't always announce these things right away, but I heard it from a trucker who came through about an hour ago." Highway 187 was a route I'd never taken, but Earl seemed to know what he was talking about. I thanked him for the tip and headed back toward the interstate. But as I drove away, something nagged at me. I'd been traveling this route for years, and I'd never seen Desert Rose Station before. The building looked old, like it had been there for decades, but somehow I'd missed it on previous trips. I found the turnoff for Highway 187 and decided to trust Earl's advice. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through desert hills and past abandoned mining claims. About 30 minutes into the detour, I crested a hill and saw something that made me pull over immediately. In the valley below, Highway 25 was lit up like a Christmas tree with emergency vehicles. There had been a massive accident. Multiple cars and at least 2 semi-trucks in what looked like a chain reaction collision. Traffic was backed up for miles in both directions. If I had stayed on Highway 25 instead of taking Earl's advice, I would have been right in the middle of that mess. Depending on when the accident happened, I might have been involved myself. I continued on Highway 187, eventually reconnecting with Highway 25 south of the accident scene. The rest of the drive to Santa Fe was uneventful, and I arrived on schedule. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank, which seemed about right. The next morning, I called a Ford dealership and described the fuel gauge problem. The service manager suggested I bring the car in for a diagnostic check, but when they hooked up their equipment, everything checked out perfectly. According to their tests, there had never been anything wrong with my car. On the drive back, I decided to stop at Desert Rose Station again, partly to thank Earl and partly to satisfy my curiosity. I took the same exit I'd used the night before, but when I reached the location where the station should have been, there was nothing there, just an empty lot with the concrete foundation of a building that had been demolished years ago. I drove around the area for 20 minutes, thinking maybe I'd taken the wrong exit, but there was only one exit for Palomas Springs, and this was definitely the right location. The Desert Rose Station, Earl, and the fuel I'd supposedly pumped had all vanished without a trace. Back in Phoenix, I researched gas stations along Highway 25. It took some digging, but eventually I found a reference to the Desert Rose Station in an old business directory from 1987. According to the listing, it had been owned and operated by Earl Morrison until his death in a car accident in November of that year. The accident report was brief but chilling. Earl Morrison, age 67, had been driving home from his gas station when he was struck head-on by a drunk driver. He died instantly, and the Desert Rose Station had closed permanently shortly afterward. The building had been demolished in 1989. I also found a newspaper article about the accident that had occurred on Highway 25 the night I'd taken the detour. 7 people had been killed and 15 injured when a semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel, causing a chain reaction collision. The accident had happened at exactly 9:47 p.m., right around the time I would have been passing through if I hadn't taken Earl's advice. I've driven that route dozens of times since then, and I always slow down when I pass the empty lot where Desert Rose Station used to be. Sometimes I think I can see a faint outline in the desert, like the ghost of a building that once stood there. I don't know if Earl Morrison's spirit is still trying to help stranded travelers, or if what I experienced was something else entirely. Maybe my fuel gauge really did malfunction at exactly the right moment to lead me to safety, but I can't explain how I pumped 22 gallons into an 18-gallon tank, or how Earl knew about an accident that hadn't happened yet. What I do know is that Earl Morrison spent his life helping people, and maybe death didn't change that. The desert keeps its secrets, but occasionally it reveals its kindness too. Earl was part of that kindness, and I believe he still is, even though his station exists now only in the memories of those who knew it. My old car chose the worst possible time to break down. I was on a solo road trip from Nashville to New Orleans, taking scenic back roads through rural Mississippi. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died with a final wheeze, leaving me stranded on a narrow, overgrown country road as the sun dipped below the horizon. I tried restarting several times, but it was no use. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by chirping crickets and distant croaking frogs. My phone had no signal, common in these parts. I was truly alone. Looking down the road, I saw nothing but dense woods. Turning back, however, I noticed something barely visible through the trees, a faint, flickering light. I grabbed my backpack and started walking toward it, the crunch of gravel under my feet unnaturally loud. The light led me to a clearing in an old Victorian house, its dark wood siding weathered and peeling, surrounded by overgrown bushes and gnarled trees. It looked like something from a Gothic novel. Grand yet decaying, with numerous dark windows that stared out like vacant eyes. The flickering light came from a single, uncurtained window on the ground floor. Despite the unsettling appearance, it was my only option. I walked up the cracked stone path, my heart thumping nervously. The air grew heavy with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves and something faintly metallic, like dust in old paper. The porch creaked ominously as I reached the heavy, ornate front door. I lifted the rusty knocker and let it fall. The sound echoed loudly, swallowed by the house's silence. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, slender man with slicked-back gray hair and a meticulously trimmed beard. He wore a dark, old-fashioned suit, and his eyes held a strange, unsettling intensity. "Can I help you?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but carried surprising weight. "My car broke down," I explained. "I saw your light. I was hoping I could use your phone, or maybe you could tell me if there's a mechanic nearby." He regarded me for a long moment, his gaze taking in every detail. Then a faint smile touched his lips. "A broken-down car, you say? Please come in. It's too dark to be out alone." He opened the door wider, revealing a dimly lit foyer filled with antique furniture and shelves crammed with books. The air inside was cool and heavy, carrying the same scent of old paper and dust, but with an added note of something sweet, like dried flowers. The man introduced himself as Mr. Silas. He led me into a cavernous living room, equally cluttered with antique furniture, taxidermied animals, and glass display cases filled with various oddities. Ancient coins, strange insects, delicate porcelain dolls with vacant stares. Every surface was covered. "I collect," Mr. Silas said, as if reading my thoughts. "All manner of things. The beautiful, the rare, the unique." He gestured vaguely at the room. "Please, make yourself comfortable. I'll see about a phone." He left me alone in the room, lit only by a single ornate lamp with a fringed shade. The shadows danced in corners, making the taxidermied animals seem almost alive. Their glass eyes seemed to follow me. My eyes scanned the room, lingering on the display cases. One case caught my attention, a collection of old, tarnished silver lockets. They were all different shapes and sizes, but each looked incredibly old, and each had a faint scratch mark on its surface, as if someone had tried to pry it open. Behind the lockets, I noticed a small, beautifully carved wooden bird, its wings spread as if in flight. It was delicate, intricate. Then I saw it, a tiny inscription on its base. Eleanor, 1948. A shiver ran down my spine. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to be out of this house, away from Mr. Silas and his unsettling collection. Just then, Mr. Silas re-entered the room. "Ah, admiring my latest acquisition," he said, his voice startling me. I jumped, turning to face him. He was standing too close, his pale eyes fixed on me. "The bird," I stammered. "It's beautiful." "Indeed. Belonged to a young woman. Lost her way, you see. Stumbled upon my humble abode. A rather unique specimen." His words sent cold dread through me. Lost her way. He turned back to me, his faint smile returning. "Yes. Much like yourself, my dear. These roads can be quite treacherous for the unprepared." He paused, his gaze sweeping over my face, lingering on my eyes, then my hair. You have such striking eyes, a lovely shade of green, quite rare. I felt a wave of nausea. His words, his gaze, the way he spoke about unique specimens. It was all too much. I felt like I was being evaluated, categorized, like another item for his collection. About that phone, I said, trying to regain composure. He chuckled softly, a dry, rustling sound. Oh, my dear, the phone lines out here haven't worked in decades. I'm afraid you'll have to stay the night. My heart hammered against my ribs. Stay the night with this man in this house of oddities? I can't. I really need to get back on the road. His smile widened, a cold, predatory expression. Nonsense, I insist. You're my guest. Besides, he said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, it would be a shame for you to get lost out there, or perhaps found by something less discerning than myself. He took a step closer, his eyes glinting. I have a vacant room, very comfortable, and in the morning we can discuss your departure. The way he said departure made it sound permanent. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to escape. I glanced around the cluttered room, looking for an exit, a weapon, anything. I'm sorry, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I really have to go. I took a step back toward the front door. He moved surprisingly fast, stepping in front of me, blocking my path. His polite demeanor had vanished, replaced by cold, unwavering resolve. I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, my dear, when something so unique wanders onto my property, I can't simply let it go. His eyes dropped to my neck, then to my hands. I felt a terrifying realization dawn. He wasn't just a collector of inanimate objects. He collected people, or rather, parts of them. The lockets with their scratch marks, the wooden bird with the engraved name, they weren't just artifacts. They were mementos. I screamed then, a raw, terrified sound. I lunged past him, pushing with all my strength. He stumbled back, surprised, and I bolted for the front door. I fumbled with the heavy latch, my fingers clumsy with terror. I could hear him moving behind me. The door burst open, and I scrambled out onto the porch, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I just ran, blindly, down the cracked stone path, past the overgrown bushes, toward the dark, silent road. I could hear his voice echoing behind me, calling out, "Come back, my dear. You belong here." I ran until my lungs burned, until the grand, decaying house was a distant, dark silhouette against the starless sky. I didn't care about my car. I just wanted distance between myself and Mr. Silas, the collector of unique specimens. I eventually found my way back to civilization, hitching a ride with a kindly old couple at dawn. But the memory of that house, and the chilling realization of what Mr. Silas truly collected, has never left me. Sometimes, when I see an old locket or a beautifully carved wooden bird, I feel a cold dread, a terrifying reminder that some people collect more than just objects, and that some detours lead to places where you become part of someone else's permanent collection. The back roads of Mississippi are full of forgotten places and forgotten people. But some of those people haven't forgotten the world, and they're still adding to their collections, one lost traveler at a time. I was lucky to escape Mr. Silas's house of horrors, but I know that somewhere out there, in another forgotten clearing, he's still waiting for the next unique specimen to wander onto his property. Driving through the desolate expanse of Nevada at 2 a.m. is an exercise in solitude. The highway stretches endlessly under a sky so vast it feels like you're driving on the ceiling of the world. My fuel light had been on for what felt like an hour, and my stomach was rumbling insistently. I was on my way from Reno to Las Vegas, a route I knew well, but tonight the familiar felt alien. Then, a miracle of neon in the vast darkness. A diner sign, its red letters sputtering "Eats" and "Gas." It was an old-fashioned establishment, a classic chrome and red vinyl diner standing alone at a dusty crossroads. There were 2 pumps outside, both looking like they hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Only one other car was in the lot, a beat-up sedan covered in dust. I pulled up to a pump, the engine dying with a sigh of relief. The air was dry and cool, smelling faintly of old coffee and desert dust. As I started pumping gas, the rhythmic clunk-clunk of the old pump filling my tank, I glanced toward the diner. The interior glowed with warm, inviting light, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. The bell above the diner door jingled as I stepped inside. The interior was exactly what I expected. Red vinyl booths, a long chrome counter, and a jukebox in the corner, though it was silent. The air was thick with the smell of frying onions, stale grease, and strong coffee. Behind the counter, a woman stood with her back to me, wiping down the already spotless surface with methodical precision. She was elderly, with tightly permed gray hair and a floral dress. There was only one other customer, a man in a worn leather jacket, hunched over coffee at the far end of the counter. "Just one?" the woman asked without turning around, her voice surprisingly clear and melodic. "Yes, please," I replied, unnerved by her knowing exactly how many people had entered. "And some gas for pump 1. She nodded slowly, then turned. Her face was surprisingly smooth for her age, almost ageless, but her eyes were a startling shade of pale blue like chipped glass, and they held an intense, unwavering gaze. She didn't smile. "Sit anywhere you like," she said, gesturing to the empty booths. Menus on the table. I chose a booth near the window, giving me a view of my car and the empty highway beyond. As I slid in, I glanced at the other customer. He was still hunched over, shoulders tense. He hadn't moved since I came in. The menu was simple, a classic diner fare. I ordered a cheeseburger and fries and coffee. The waitress, whose name tag read Martha, wrote it down without making eye contact. As she walked back to the kitchen, I noticed the man at the counter stir. He slowly lifted his head, and I caught a glimpse of his face in the chrome counter's reflection. His eyes were wide, haunted, and he looked pale, almost ashen. He seemed to be staring at something beyond the counter, toward the back of the diner. Martha returned with my coffee, placing it down with a soft clink. As she did, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's been here all night, waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, a shiver running down my spine. She gave me a faint, unsettling smile. "For the right time. For the road to call." My burger arrived quickly, hot and greasy, exactly what I needed, but the conversation had ruined my appetite. I tried to eat, but I kept glancing at the man. He hadn't touched his coffee. He just sat there, rigid, staring. Then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound from the back of the diner near the kitchen door. It was rhythmic, like claws dragging lightly across wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I glanced at Martha, who was wiping down another section of counter. She didn't seem to notice. The man at the counter, however, visibly flinched. His body tensed further. The scratching grew louder, accompanied by a faint, high-pitched whine like a hungry animal. It sounded like it was coming from under the diner. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone. "What is that sound?" I asked Martha. She turned, her expression unreadable. "Just the wind, dear. This old place makes all sorts of noises." But her eyes darted toward the back of the diner, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. The scratching and whining intensified. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way up from beneath the floorboards. The man at the counter suddenly slammed his fist down, a loud thud that made me jump. "No!" he yelled, his voice hoarse, filled with desperate terror. "Not tonight! I'm not going!" Martha turned slowly, her gaze fixing on him. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes held cold, unwavering authority. "The road calls when it calls, dear. You can't fight it forever." As she spoke, the scratching and whining reached a crescendo, a frantic, desperate sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Then a new sound, a deep, guttural moan, like something ancient and immense stretching awake. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from beneath the diner, from the desert outside, from the very air itself. The man at the counter began to tremble violently. He slowly, reluctantly, pushed himself off the stool. His movements were stiff, like a puppet on strings. He looked at Martha, his eyes wide with profound, terrifying resignation. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Just one more night." Martha shook her head, a faint, almost pitying smile on her lips. "The road is waiting, dear. It doesn't like to be kept waiting." As she finished speaking, the deep moan outside intensified, a haunting, mournful sound that seemed to pull at reality itself. The man turned, shoulders slumped, and slowly walked toward the diner door. He didn't look back. He didn't say another word. He just walked out into the oppressive darkness of the Nevada desert. I watched him go, utterly horrified. I saw him get into his dusty car, start the engine, and slowly pull out of the lot, driving toward the endless dark highway in the direction from which the mournful moans seemed to emanate. His taillights quickly vanished into the darkness. The scratching and whining from beneath the diner stopped. The deep moan faded into a low, lingering hum. Then silence. The air felt lighter, but the terror was still a cold knot in my stomach. Martha turned back to me, her pale blue eyes fixed on mine. She picked up my plate, still mostly full. "More coffee, dear?" she asked, her voice back to its calm, melodic tone as if nothing had happened. I shook my head, unable to speak. I fumbled for my wallet, threw cash on the counter, and scrambled out of the booth. I had to get out of there, away from Martha, from the Crossroads diner, from whatever ancient, hungry thing waited on the desolate Nevada highway. I ran to my car, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't look back at the diner. I just sped out of the lot, tires spitting gravel, heading in the opposite direction from which the man had driven. I never stopped at a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere again. The Crossroads diner, with its ageless waitress and its hungry road, was a terrifying reminder that some places aren't just fuel stops. They're hungry mouths, waiting for the right moment and the right traveler to answer the call of the desert. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through Nevada, I think I can hear it in the distance, that deep, mournful moan carried on the desert wind. It's the sound of the road calling, and somewhere out there, Martha is still waiting at her counter, serving coffee to travelers who have run out of time to fight what's coming for them. The desert is patient, but it's also hungry. And at the crossroads where all paths converge, there's always someone waiting to collect what the road is owed. The sun was setting, painting the vast skies of Iowa in fiery hues. But the beauty was lost on me. I was exhausted, driving east from Omaha, trying to make it to Chicago in one push. My eyes burned, and my back ached. I'd been on the road since before dawn, and the endless fields of corn stretching to the horizon were starting to feel less picturesque and more claustrophobic. My fuel gauge was teetering on empty, and I desperately needed a break. I spotted a small hand-painted sign by the roadside. Gas. 2 miles. The road narrowed, turning into a 2-lane highway flanked by even denser cornfields, the stalks taller than my car, rustling ominously in the evening breeze. The gas station appeared almost out of nowhere, a single dilapidated structure with one pump nestled at a tiny crossroads. It looked like it had been swallowed by the corn, barely visible amidst the tall stalks. There were no other cars, no lights on in the small attached convenience store. The entire place felt abandoned. My gut screamed at me to keep driving, to risk running out of gas. But exhaustion won. I pulled up to the pump, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the incessant, dry rustling of the corn and distant chirping of unseen insects. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, growing corn and something else. Something faintly sweet and cloying, like decaying vegetation. I got out, the crunch of my shoes on gravel unnaturally loud. As I started pumping gas, the rhythmic click of the meter the only consistent sound, I felt a familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I spun around, scanning the cornfields. Nothing, just endless green stalks, swaying gently in the breeze. But the feeling persisted. The distinct sensation of being watched. Not from the convenience store, which remained dark and lifeless, but from the corn itself. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue, but the feeling was too strong, too insistent. I finished pumping, paid at the pump with my card, and decided to stretch my legs before getting back on the road. The sun had almost completely set now, casting long, eerie shadows across the fields. The corn stalks seemed to stretch higher in the dim light, their rustling sounding less like wind and more like hushed whispers. As I walked toward the edge of the field, just a few feet from the gas pump, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, a cold spot in the warm evening air. Then I saw them, eyes. They were deep within the cornfield, just beyond the first few rows of stalks, glinting faintly in the deepening twilight. Dozens of them, small, round, and reflecting the last vestiges of light with a dull, yellowish glow. They were perfectly still, arranged in clusters, sometimes high, sometimes low, but always staring directly out of the corn toward the gas station, toward me. My breath hitched in my throat. I froze, my blood turning to ice. These weren't animal eyes. They were too numerous, too organized, too human-like in their stillness. They held no warmth, no curiosity, just a cold, unwavering observation. It was like looking into a sea of tiny, malevolent lamps. A wave of primal fear washed over me. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the sheer number of those silent, watching eyes. The rustling of the corn seemed to intensify, sounding like a collective sigh, a soft, predatory murmur. I felt a terrifying realization dawn on me. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. I slowly, cautiously, took a step back, then another, my eyes still fixed on the cornfield. The eyes didn't move. They didn't blink. They just watched my retreat. As I backed away, I could feel the cold spot moving with me, a pocket of unnatural chill emanating from the field. I stumbled back to my car, fumbling with the door handle, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp it. I scrambled inside, locking the doors with a frantic click. I didn't even bother with my seatbelt. I just started the engine, the roar of it a comforting sound that barely masked the frantic pounding of my heart. I threw the car into reverse, backed out quickly, and sped out of the gas station lot. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I just drove, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, desperate to put distance between myself and that field of silent, watching eyes. As I sped down the narrow highway, the cornfields on either side seemed to close in, their towering stalks a wall of green. I kept glancing left and right, half expecting to see those glowing eyes appear in the darkness, following me. Every rustle of the corn, every shadow made me jump. I drove for what felt like hours, until the cornfields finally gave way to more open pastures, and then the distant glow of a town. Only then did I allow myself to slow down. My body trembling, my hands still clenching the steering wheel. I never understood what those eyes were. Were they some kind of local phenomenon, a strange ritual of the corn farmers? Or something far older, far more sinister, a forgotten entity that resided in the endless fields, waiting for lone travelers to stumble upon its domain? The memory of those silent, watching eyes has never left me. Sometimes, when I drive past fields of tall corn, even in broad daylight, I feel a cold dread creep into my stomach. I imagine those eyes, hidden deep within the stalks, waiting patiently, silently, for the next traveler to break down, to stop for gas, to venture too close to the hidden world. The cornfields of Iowa, once a symbol of peaceful Americana, now hold a terrifying secret for me. A place where I was watched by something that didn't want to be seen, but made its presence undeniably known. In those endless rows of corn, something ancient and patient dwells, and it's always watching, always waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to venture into its domain. The snow started falling just as I crossed into northern Michigan, a soft, innocent flurry that quickly escalated into a full-blown blizzard. I was trying to make it to my sister's cabin for a quiet Thanksgiving, but the weather had other plans. My old SUV was struggling against the deepening drifts, and visibility dropped to almost zero. I knew I couldn't keep going. The roads were becoming impassable, and the thought of getting stuck miles from anywhere was terrifying. Just as I was about to pull over and resign myself to a night in the car, a faint, flickering light pierced through the whiteout. It looked like a remote gas station, its sign completely obscured by snow, but the single pump was illuminated by a bare bulb. I carefully maneuvered off the main road, tires crunching through thick snow. The gas station was a small, squat building, almost completely buried in drifts. There were no other cars, no other signs of life. The silence, broken only by the howl of wind and hiss of falling snow, was profound and absolute. I cut the engine, and warmth immediately began to dissipate. The cold seeped in, a bone-chilling presence. I knew I needed gas, but the thought of getting out into that storm was daunting. The air was thick with the smell of pine, wet snow, and something faintly metallic and icy like frozen earth. I eventually mustered courage, bundled up in my thickest coat, and stepped out. The wind immediately tore at my clothes, stinging exposed skin with icy needles. I struggled to the pump, boots sinking into deep snow. As I started pumping, the rhythmic thump-thump of the old machine was almost swallowed by the blizzard's roar. Through swirling snow, I could just make out the dark, unlit windows of the gas station building. It looked completely deserted. I shivered, not just from cold, but from the unsettling isolation. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. Then I saw it. A faint movement in one of the windows, almost obscured by snow. A shadow. A figure. It was brief, fleeting, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. Someone was inside, and they were watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of light, a branch swaying in wind, but the image was too clear. A dark shape, pressed against glass, observing me through the storm. I finished pumping, fingers numb with cold, and fumbled with the nozzle. I didn't bother going inside to pay. I knew this place felt wrong. I just wanted to get back in my car and drive away, blizzard or not. As I struggled back to my SUV, fighting against wind and snow, I glanced back at the gas station window. The shadow was still there, and this time it was clearer. It was a person, their face obscured by dimness and snow, but their posture was unmistakable. They were standing perfectly still, watching me with unwavering intensity. I scrambled into my SUV, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps. I started the engine, the roar welcome, and immediately cranked the heat. I put the car in drive, but the tires spun uselessly in deep snow. I was stuck. Panic washed over me. I tried rocking the car, shifting between drive and reverse, but it was no use. The snow was too deep. I was trapped. And then, a new sound. Faint at first, almost swallowed by the blizzard. A soft, rhythmic thump. 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 It sounded like footsteps in deep snow, crunching slowly, deliberately, approaching my car. My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned off my headlights, plunging the interior into near darkness, hoping to blend in with the whiteout. I pressed myself against the seat, straining my ears, my eyes fixed on the passenger side window, then the driver's side. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were heavy, measured, moving slowly around my vehicle. Thump, thump, thump. They circled my SUV, each crunch of snow sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, my whole body trembling. I could feel a presence outside, a cold, silent observer moving through the storm. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear. The footsteps stopped directly outside my driver's side door. The silence that followed was terrifying, broken only by the relentless howl of wind. I could almost feel the weight of a gaze pressing against the window, even through thick snow and darkness. And then a faint, almost imperceptible tap on the glass. Just one. Soft but distinct. Tap. My eyes flew open. I stared at the snow-covered window, seeing nothing but a blurry white canvas. Another tap. Tap. This one slightly louder, more insistent. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. I was paralyzed with fear, utterly helpless, trapped in my car, surrounded by the blizzard and whatever was outside. Then, a new sound. A low, guttural moan carried on the wind, seeming to come from the depths of the gas station building itself. It was a mournful, ancient sound, full of sorrow and hunger. And then, a whisper, barely audible above the wind, right outside my window. "He's cold." My blood ran cold. The voice was breathy, almost ethereal, but undeniably there. And then another whisper, different this time, deeper, more guttural. "He wants inside." I gasped, a small, choked sound. I could feel my body shaking uncontrollably. I pressed myself further into the seat, trying to make myself smaller, invisible. The taps on the window stopped. The whispers faded. The footsteps receded, slowly, deliberately, back into the swirling whiteout. The mournful moan from the gas station building grew fainter, then vanished. I stayed there for what felt like hours, rigid with terror, listening to the blizzard's relentless roar. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. I waited for the sun to rise, for the first hint of light, for anything to break the terrifying hold of the night. As the first gray light of dawn began to pierce through heavy clouds, the blizzard started to die down. The wind lessened, the snow eased. I risked a glance out my window. The gas station building was still there, half buried in snow. The single pump was still illuminated, but there was no sign of footsteps, no sign of the shadow in the window, just pristine, untouched snow. I tried the ignition again. To my surprise, the SUV started. I put it in reverse, gently rocking it, and this time the tires found purchase. Slowly, carefully, I managed to back out of the drift and onto the main road. I didn't look back. I just drove, my body still trembling, my mind reeling. I never made it to my sister's cabin that Thanksgiving. I drove straight to the nearest town, found a motel, and didn't leave my room for 2 days. I never understood what I encountered that night. Was it an old ghost trapped in the gas station? Or something else, something that fed on the lost and stranded in the unforgiving embrace of the Michigan blizzard? The memory of those whispers and the tapping on my window is a chilling reminder that sometimes, when you're alone in the storm, it's not just the elements you need to fear. There are other things, unseen, unheard, that wait in the whiteout, and they want more than just shelter from the cold. I was in the middle of a cross-country move, driving a rental truck packed with all my worldly possessions from Seattle to Atlanta. It was a grueling journey, and I was utterly exhausted. Somewhere in the middle of Arkansas, the sun had already set, leaving the highway a dark tunnel through dense forests. My fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low. A sign for a gas station appeared, a faded, flickering neon beacon. Holcomb's Stop and Go. It looked like a relic from another decade, a small brick building with a single old-fashioned pump. There were no other cars in the lot, just the oppressive silence of the rural night. I pulled the massive rental truck up to the pump, the engine groaning to a halt. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, pine needles, and something faintly sweet, like decaying leaves. As I got out, the crunch of my boots on gravel sounded unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. I started pumping gas, the rhythmic clunk-clunk of the old meter the only sound. My eyes scanned the dark windows of the convenience store. They were unlit, but I could just make out vague shapes of shelves inside. It looked closed. My heart sank. How would I pay? Just as I was about to give up, a faint light flickered on inside the store. A moment later, the door creaked open and a man emerged. He was tall and slender, with a shock of white hair and a gaunt face. He wore a heavy, dark coat, despite the mild evening air, and carried an old, battered lantern that cast dancing shadows around him. His eyes, even from a distance, seemed unnervingly bright. "Evening," he called out, his voice raspy, yet surprisingly clear. "You need help?" "Just gas," I replied, feeling a wave of relief. "Thought you were closed." "Never closed," he said, a faint, unsettling smile touching his lips. "Not for those who truly need it." He slowly walked toward me, his gait slightly uneven, the lantern swinging gently, casting long, shifting shadows. As he approached, I noticed his eyes again. They were a pale, almost translucent blue, and they seemed to bore into me with unsettling intensity. He didn't just look at me. He seemed to assess me, his gaze lingering on my face, then my hands, then my rental truck. "Long drive, I reckon," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over the truck, taking in the moving company logos. "New beginnings, eh?" "Something like that," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but feeling growing unease. His questions felt too personal, too probing. He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on me. "I see a lot of folks pass through here, all sorts, some looking for something, some running from something." He paused, his pale eyes narrowing slightly. "Which one are you?" My heart began to beat faster. "Just driving, need to get this gas paid for." He chuckled softly, a dry, rustling sound. No rush, plenty of time. We don't get many visitors this late, especially with such interesting cargo." He gestured vaguely at my truck. "Moving all your memories, are we?" A shiver traced down my spine. The way he spoke, the way he seemed to know things, it was unnerving. I just wanted to pay and leave. He finally turned to the pump, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each action required immense effort. He fiddled with a small rusted lever, and the meter clicked to a stop. "That'll be $78.50, he announced, his voice flat. I pulled out my wallet, fingers feeling clumsy. As I handed him the cash, his cold, dry fingers brushed mine. He didn't immediately take the money. Instead, his gaze dropped to my forearm, where a faded childhood scar was visible. A small, jagged line from a bike accident when I was 7. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Ah," he whispered, a strange, almost hungry look in his eyes. A mark of resilience, a story etched in flesh. He slowly, delicately traced the scar with his cold fingertip. I flinched, pulling my arm away sharply. "What are you doing?" He smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that revealed too many teeth. "Forgive me. I simply appreciate details, the unique imprints of a life lived." His gaze swept over me again, lingering on my eyes, then my hair. "You have a very distinct energy, a certain kind of vulnerability, mixed with surprising strength. Quite a rare combination. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a strange gas station attendant. This was something else. A collector, perhaps, not of objects, but of something far more sinister. Memories? Experiences? Souls? His words about interesting cargo and memories suddenly took on a terrifying new meaning. "I need to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I grabbed my receipt from his hand, my eyes wide with terror. He didn't try to stop me. He just watched me, his pale eyes gleaming in the lantern light, that unsettling smile still on his face. "Of course," he murmured, his voice soft, almost soothing. "But remember, some things, once seen, cannot be unseen, and some connections, once made, are never truly broken." I scrambled back into my rental truck, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely put the key in the ignition. I started the engine, the powerful roar of the diesel a comforting sound. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was still standing by the gas pump, the lantern held high, casting his gaunt face in stark relief. He wasn't waving. He was just watching me, his pale eyes fixed on the retreating truck, that unsettling smile still on his lips. And then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer in the air around him, a distortion of light, like heat rising from asphalt, but it was cold. And within that shimmer, for a fleeting second, I thought I saw other faint shapes, indistinct figures swirling around him like smoke, like shadows clinging to a central core. My breath hitched. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing the massive truck to its limit. I didn't look back again. I just drove, heart pounding, the image of his pale eyes and the swirling shadows burned into my mind. But it wasn't over. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel a cold prickle on my arm, right where that old scar is. And I wonder if the collector's shadow still watches, still remembers, still feels that unsettling connection, waiting for the day when my distinct energy might be ready for his permanent collection. The back roads of Arkansas are full of forgotten places and forgotten people. But some of those people haven't forgotten the world, and they're still adding to their collections, one lost traveler at a time. I was lucky to escape, but I know that somewhere out there, in another forgotten gas station, he's still waiting for the next soul with a story worth collecting. The long drive through the Arizona desert was supposed to be invigorating, a cleansing of the soul before starting a new job in Los Angeles. Instead, it was becoming a test of endurance. My small car wasn't built for these endless stretches, and the sun had baked the landscape into a shimmering, mirage-filled oven. Now, as dusk bled across the sky, painting distant mountains in shades of purple and black, my fuel light clicked on. Panic began to set in. I hadn't seen a gas station for what felt like hours, and my GPS was showing nothing but empty desert ahead. Just as I was resigning myself to being stranded, a faint, almost ghostly glow appeared on the horizon. It was a single, flickering fluorescent sign. Last chance. Gaze. Relief washed over me, quickly followed by a prickle of unease. The sign looked ancient, half-broken, and the station appeared to be miles off the main road, down a narrow, unpaved track that snaked into the deepening twilight. But it was my only option. I turned off the highway, tires crunching loudly on loose gravel. The track led me to a small, isolated outpost. The gas station was a tiny, ramshackle building, its paint peeling, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and the vast, silent desert. There was a single, rusted pump, and next to it, an old, faded diner sign that simply read, "Eat." No other cars, no other lights anywhere. The air was dry and still, smelling of hot dust, stale gasoline, and something faintly sweet and acrid, like burnt sugar. I pulled up to the pump, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by chirping crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. I got out, legs stiff, and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the desert night. The sky was an inky black canvas, crowded with stars, but the darkness on the ground felt heavy, almost suffocating. As I started pumping gas, the rhythmic clunk-clunk of the old meter sounding unnaturally loud, I glanced at the diner. It was small, with only a few booths visible through grimy windows. A single bare bulb hung inside, casting a weak yellow glow that barely pushed back the shadows. Just then, the door to the diner creaked open, and a figure emerged. It was an old woman, incredibly frail, with hair like spun cotton and eyes that seemed too large for her gaunt face. She wore a faded floral dress that looked too thin for the desert night. She moved slowly, deliberately, carrying a small, flickering oil lamp. "Evening, dear," she said, her voice a reedy whisper that somehow carried clearly across the quiet lot. "Late for a traveler." "Just trying to make it to L.A., I replied, trying to sound confident despite growing unease. "Didn't think there'd be anything out here." She chuckled softly, a dry, rustling sound. "Oh, there's always something out here, always. This is the last stop, you see. Before nowhere." She slowly approached me, her eyes, dark and ancient, fixed on mine with unsettling intensity. "Last stop?" I asked, shiver running down my spine. She nodded, her gaze sweeping across the vast, dark desert surrounding us. "Beyond this, there's nothing, just what waits, and it doesn't wait long." My heart began to pound. Her words were cryptic, ominous. I tried to dismiss them as ramblings of an old, isolated woman, but the way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to hold ancient knowledge, was deeply unsettling. "I just need to pay for my gas," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to normalcy. She nodded again, her movements slow and deliberate. "Of course, dear. Come inside. It's warmer." She turned and shuffled back toward the diner, her oil lamp casting dancing shadows around her. I hesitated, my gut screaming at me to just get in my car and drive, empty tank or not. But the thought of being stranded in this absolute nowhere was even more terrifying. I followed her, my footsteps crunching on gravel. The diner was small and cramped, filled with the smell of stale grease, dust, and that same sweet, acrid scent. The single bulb cast a sickly yellow light. There were only 2 booths, both empty. The counter was old and scarred, and behind it, a shelf held a few dusty cans of food. The old woman went behind the counter, placing her oil lamp down. "What else can I get you?" she whispered, her eyes still fixed on mine. "A bite to eat, some water for the road." "Just the gas," I said, handing her my credit card. She took it, her fingers surprisingly cold, and slowly, painstakingly, ran it through an ancient manual card imprinter. The process was agonizingly slow, each clunk of the machine echoing in the quiet diner. As she worked, I noticed something on the wall behind her, a collection of old faded photographs tacked up haphazardly. They were all black and white, showing people, mostly men, standing by the gas pump, smiling, looking like travelers. But their faces, there was something unsettling about their smiles, a faint, almost imperceptible hollowness in their eyes, and the dates beneath them were old, very old, some from the 40s, 50s, 60s. "Who are these people?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The old woman looked up, her dark eyes meeting mine. "Travelers," she said, her voice flat. "Just like you, dear. They all stopped here, at the last chance." She paused, her gaze drifting over the photographs, a faint, almost sorrowful expression on her face. "They all went on, beyond this place, into nowhere." My blood ran cold, the way she said nowhere, the way she looked at the photographs. It wasn't just a geographical description. It was something else. A destination. A permanent one. "Did they come back?" I asked, my voice trembling. She shook her head slowly. "Oh no, no one ever comes back from nowhere. Not once the road takes them." She finished the transaction, handing me my card and receipt. "Be careful out there, dear. The desert is hungry, and sometimes it sends things to look for company." Her words were a chilling confirmation of my deepest fears. I grabbed my card and receipt, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't say another word. I practically bolted from the diner, the bell above the door jingling frantically as I burst out into the oppressive darkness. I scrambled into my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I started the engine, the roar a sudden, jarring sound in the profound silence. As I sped out of the lot, tires spitting gravel, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The old woman was standing in the doorway of the diner, her oil lamp held high, a small, frail silhouette against the weak yellow glow. She wasn't waving. She was just watching me, her dark, ancient eyes fixed on my retreating car. And then, just as I was about to turn back onto the main highway, I saw it, or felt it, a profound, chilling cold that swept through my car despite the hot desert air. And in my rearview mirror, for a fleeting second, I thought I saw faint, shimmering figures, like heat haze, coalescing around the old woman in the diner doorway. They were indistinct, shadowy, but they seemed to be reaching out, their forms stretching toward my car, like hungry tendrils. My breath hitched. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, pushing my car to its absolute limit. I didn't look back again. I just drove, tears streaming down my face. The image of the old woman and the shadowy figures burned into my mind. I drove until the sun began to paint the eastern sky, until the desert finally gave way to the distant lights of civilization. I never forgot the Last Chance gas station, or the old woman who ran it. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I feel a cold prickle on the back of my neck, and I wonder if the desert is still hungry, if nowhere is still waiting, and if the old woman and her shadowy companions are still watching the road, waiting for the next traveler to take their last chance before vanishing into the terrifying, hungry void. The desert keeps its secrets, but occasionally it reveals its hunger too. Some places aren't just the last stop before nowhere. They're the gateway to it, and once you've been marked by their watchers, you never really escape their pull.